Good evening. My name is Dan Gopnik. I'm the president of Riverside Park Conservancy. We are the not-for-profit organization supporting 6 miles of Manhattan parkland on the Hudson River from 59th to 181st Streets. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for your support of the Conservancy. I am so honored to be able to welcome you to an important discussion about the future of cities. And of course, parks are critical to how we live in a dense urban environment. We all understand that New York City has had a painfully difficult year with serious challenges to come. People are down, struggling, and worried about the future. As a former New York City councilman, I will state my bias up front. You can knock this city down, rough it up a bit, perhaps, but no place is tougher and more resilient than New York and New Yorkers. So let me introduce you to 2 tough and resilient New Yorkers right now. First, Adam Gopnik. Adam Gopnik has been a staff writer for the New Yorker since 1986. He is an author of children's novels, essay collections, a musical, and most recently, A Thousand Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism. He has won national magazine awards for essays, for criticism, for reporting, and for arts writing. He lives in New York with his wife and 2 children. I have to mention about Adam and his family. Adam wrote a piece in the New Yorker in 2002 about his then 3-year-old daughter, Olivia, who is now 21, and her imaginary playmate named Charlie Ravioli. And one of the most New York City stories ever, Adam noted that Olivia's playmate was always too busy to play with her. As he wrote it, she holds her toy cell phone up to her ear, and we hear her talk into it. Ravioli, it's Olivia. It's Olivia. Come and play? Oh, okay, call me. Bye. And she snaps it shut and shakes her head. I always get his machine. I love this piece so much that I had readers share it out loud in my inauguration to the City Council. Welcome, Adam Gopnik. We are so happy to have you here with us tonight. And Adam tonight will be asking the hard questions to our distinguished guest, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria is a journalist, political commentator, and has hosted CNN's Fareed Zakaria GPS, a weekly international and domestic affairs program since 2008. He writes a weekly column for the Washington Post. Fareed was named a top 10 global thinker of the last 10 years by Foreign Policy magazine in 2019. Esquire once called him the most influential foreign policy advisor of his generation. And in Riverside Park, we call him our neighbor. Fareed Zakaria is always there for us, and we feel very, very lucky about that. And his new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, came out on October 6th. A reminder, with your donation of $50 to Riverside Park Conservancy tonight, we will send you a copy of the book. You can text CITIES, C-I-T-I-E-S, to 91999, and thanks to all of you who have already done so. Just quick on ground rules tonight. You are welcome to pose questions for Adam or Fareed in the YouTube video chat, which is right to the next to the screen. And Adam will screen them and introduce them as he sees fit in the discussion. So that is enough by way of introduction. I am so happy to introduce you to our 2 guests. Please join me in welcoming Fareed Zakaria, and allow me to turn the program over to Adam Gopnik. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Indeed, Charlie Ravioli may still rule the streets, but Olivia, his creator, is now off at college. And as I said to someone not very long ago, she has become my imaginary friend, as all adult children do. She occupies my mind, but I rarely actually get to see her. Fareed, it's such a pleasure to be with you. I wish we could be together over a table and a good glass of wine. I have a chicken roasting in the other room. As Fareed knows, my real passions in life are cooking and music. But if I have a preoccupation in life, it's all of the things that are embodied in Fareed's extraordinary new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. Because in addition to being a book of recommendations, a book of policy prescriptions, it's above all a book of philosophical analysis, if I may say. It tries to take a broader look at where we are now than one could typically or indeed ever find in the pages of a newspaper. And it demonstrates, if I may say for Reed, one of the things that makes your work so singular, and that is the incredible horizontality of its grasp. Everything that I read in your book about New York strikes me as true, but then everything that I read in your book about India and China and Japan strikes me as equally compelling, and I suspect equally true. I don't think anybody writing today has the breadth of engagement of Fareed Zakaria. But if we may, Fareed, let's try and focus, I thought, tonight, a little bit on the specific at hand here, which is New York City. And I thought we'd start there and move beyond. You say in this book, and I think it's profoundly true, that New York is perpetually being declared dead and is perpetually reviving. And you point out that this process actually began in the 18th century. It isn't just a contemporary one. When New York was written off after a plague, after a kind of pandemic in its time. And I certainly have, in my own relatively brief time in New York, maybe not so brief, 40 years with some time off in Paris, I have known New York to be declared dead at least 3 times in my experience. First, during the great crime epidemic of the late 80s and early 90s. Then again, this is the one people tend to forget after 9/11, when the standard rule was that New York was finished. Who would ever build a skyscraper or open a head office again in New York after what had happened? And now in the pandemic, when we're told by the man I hope we can call ex-President Trump that New York was finished, shuttered, done in all those ways. But this one, if I may say, Fareed, does seem to have a kind of urgency that the others perhaps have not. We drive. I went down to my favorite place, the Green Market in New York City, earlier today, yesterday actually, and we see buildings boarded up. We see fewer people on the streets, everyone appropriately masked. What confidence do you have, as you expressed it in this book, that New York can rebound and revive again from this injury? And let me just add, and forgive me for making this such a long-winded question, but let me just add, because the problem, as you identified, is not just the things that the pandemic has made happen to New York, but the reality that, as with any crisis, all of the things that were already stressed and fractured in the city are ever more stressed or fractured. The pandemic acts as a kind of X-ray of every little hairline fracture in the city and turns it into an aggravated break. And we see that in terms of social inequality, things as varied as social inequality and the disappearance of retail, of brick and mortar retail. What confidence can you have that New York can rebound yet again?
Well, first, let me begin by just thanking you, Adam, for doing this. I roped Adam into doing this because when the Riverside Park Conservancy and I discussed doing some kind of a benefit for the park, we sort of thought about the ideal interlocutor. And I said, the dream would be to get Adam Gopnik, and they readily agreed. And so we thought, well, how should we try? And I thought, all right, let's try the old-fashioned way. I just sent Adam an email, and he said, yes, sure. And so there it is. Now, to understand the reverence that Adam has held in my family, I've had a fair number of interesting people come to the house and, occasionally sign a book for my kids. My 2 daughters, I remember this is just about a year ago, my now 12-year-old, then 11-year-old Sophia said to me, ruminating on the people who she had met, and she looked at me and said, I can't believe you know the author of Steps Across the Water. That is one of Adam's great children's books. And of all the books that she has, and it just seemed to her that this was kind of outside the realm of normal for me to actually know this man, Adam Gopnik. Knowing Obama didn't seem to strike her as kind of particularly interesting. But
that moves me beyond words, because though it's true that musicals and cooking are my passions, my deepest literary imagination was invested in the two children's books I wrote, Steps Across the Water and The King in the Window. So that means more, that expands my heart to a degree that it's about ready to burst out of my chest. And I thank her for that. And I should add that Fareed's kids are as extraordinary as you might expect. And grew up in New York. And
grew up in New York.
And we both believed very passionately, I'm focusing us on the subject, that New York was far from being a difficult place to raise kids, was the best possible place to raise kids in every way, from their obviously access to every cultural treasure, but also in the simple sense that suburban kids get in cars when they're 16 and you worry about them. Our kids got on buses and subways that someone else was driving, which is in fact feels safer. But
and in fact, I think that when you think about that ability, my kids walked to school, walked to Riverside Park, had soccer games there. Most of their friends were within walking distance. I've always thought that the line about New York, it's a great place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there, has it exactly backwards.
Yes.
Actually, if you were to come to New York for 2 days and go to Times Square and all that stuff, it's a nightmare. I mean, Midtown New York in the old days certainly was, I felt like you were going to get cancer just by walking around the traffic and everything. But if you live here, as most of you know, you choose a neighborhood, because New York is really a collection of neighborhoods. And because of the density of the city, you are able to find everything you want within a 10-block area. That is almost unique about New York. That's not even true about London. There are a few cities, but the density of New York allows for a kind of complete neighborhood experience within 10 or 15 blocks. And that's what makes it magical to my mind. But
and I think that the only other city in my experience, and my experience is limited compared to yours, that has that quality is Paris, where you have a shopping street, residential. And just let me add as a footnote, before we launch, I think that's one of the reasons why, in fact, the pandemic, with all of its unimaginable pain for New Yorkers, has also been in some ways sustainable. The lockdown was sustainable exactly because we could be within our 10-block radius and not feel confined, because the 10-block radius is the radius in which we normally live.
Exactly. But, all right, to your larger question, which is obviously the central question for cities. So for me, one of the things that I do when I get stressed, when I worry, is I try to read, and I try to understand and research. And one of the bombs of this pandemic and the lockdown, watching New York get deserted and the subway ridership go down 90%, and all that, was to get some perspective by looking at history. So as you know, I went all the way back. I mean, I looked at the bubonic plague and was interested. I was about to say delighted, but that wouldn't be the right word. Fascinated to find that, Boccaccio in the Decameron actually describes how the Florentines, the inhabitants of Florence, did exactly what New Yorkers did, particularly the rich ones. They fled. They went to places. This is during the bubonic plague.
Yes, really, the hills outside Florence, right?
Exactly, Fiesole, people like that, places like that, and they sat at home and they cooked meals in their country houses and they told stories to one another, which is, I think, the 14th century equivalent of watching Netflix.
Yes, watching long form series, exactly.
Exactly, but they came back, and they came back quickly enough that within 100 years, of course, Florence was the center of the Renaissance. If you look at the plagues in London, the 17th century, you have two great plagues and a fire. What happens is people all flee London, and then they come back and they build back better, to put it in the phrase that Biden likes to use. They took a London that was built out of wood, and they built it into the brick and stone London that we know now. And as you say, American cities went through this. Philadelphia, probably more than New York, went through the biggest one, which was a yellow fever plague.
Yes, it's from Philadelphia. I'm surprised.
In 1870s. And Jefferson, who always hated cities, was delighted and said this means that the cities, big cities are going to end in America. Philadelphia at the time was the largest. It decimated the city. I mean, literally 1 out of 10 died, and it came back. And as you point out, there's the three you noted, and of course, as you know, you can go back to the 70s, which was a combination of fiscal bankruptcy plus crime.
Fort to city drop dead, right?
Right, Fort to city drop dead, plus the suburbs. and it's important to remember just how precarious New York was in those days when the mayor of New York at the time, what is the name? John Lindsay, decides he wants to show that he's going to do something incredibly bold and walk through the most crime-infested part of New York as a way of signaling his resolve. He walks on 86th Street from Central Park West to Columbus, which today is, of course,
you couldn't buy,
kind of like
an apartment for under
exactly
on that.
$20 million apartments and $40 million brownstones. But what I think is true about New York is that it has this extraordinary vitality because it is one of the, there are a handful of cities in the world that have this vibrancy, that have huge industries where people want to come. So if you watch, Hudson Yards is getting decimated because retail is getting lost. Neiman Marcus is declared bankruptcy. So what happens to the space in Neiman Marcus? Well, apparently the tech companies are vying over it. Amazon is expanding into New York. Google is expanding. Facebook is expanding. Why? Because young people still want to live there. So I think that, look, there are enormous challenges. And the challenge of Zoom, of the very technology that we are now using, which we all call Zoom as a shorthand, is what makes this different, just as the suburbs and automobiles on the highways made the challenge of the 70s particularly potent. But that is, I think, the most relevant analogy, which is this. There is a real structural crisis here because you have an alternative. In the 70s, it was essentially the suburbs and the car. Yeah. Today, it is telecommuting, Zoom, and the digital technology. That still leaves you with the reality that people, that, as I say in the book, human beings are social, man is a social animal, says Aristotle. We want to get together. We want to gather. We want to compete, to collaborate. You make more money by being close to people in that fashion. Ed Glazer, the economist, has wonderful work on this. But the crucial issue then becomes, can the city manage itself well enough to make the pivot it needs to? In the 70s, the city was badly mismanaged, declared bankruptcy, went through essentially a really bad decade, maybe by some counts 15 years before it revived. The challenge for us now is that New York can come back. I wouldn't say that about every city. I wouldn't say that about, even big cities in some of the smaller countries in the world. But New York is one of the handful of global cities in the world. People from all over the world want to come here. They want to live here. They want to visit. People all over the country want to work here. The challenge is, can it be well managed? And this is where, it's very disheartening, honestly. If you look at just the most recent example of uniquely bad New York government, do you know that you've watched the election totals? Every state in America, by the way, we have a crazy system of voting where it goes on for weeks and weeks. And I grew up in India. Now they do voting on electronic machines.
It's over like that, right?
1.2 billion people. It's over in a day. It takes them 3 or 4 weeks to stagger the election because they get poll watchers, and 1.2 billion people, to all over the country is hard. But the actual vote, by the instant it's done. So most states, most cities have, at 98%, 99%. New York is still at 60%. The way we administer elections in New York City is abysmal. Right. So that becomes the central challenge. If we fail, Adam, in my view, we will fail because of bad governance, not because of these structural challenges. The structural challenges require adjustment and reorientation. Bad government is what causes failure.
That's a brilliant answer for you. Let me add just a couple of points to it, if I may. You mentioned, the first is somewhat racy. You mentioned, cooperation, collegiality, all those good things that cities bring. I'd add another C to the list, and that's copulation. I remember after 9/11, I was, like everyone, I was grief-stricken and traumatized, and I went for a walk with a real estate tycoon. Say it was Mort Zuckerman, actually, who I know because he's a fellow Canadian. And I said to him, we toured, the what was still then the frozen zone, as they called it, the frozen zone downtown. And I said to him, do you have hope for the renewal of New York? This was in the week after when when people were saying you got to leave New York, it's just going to be a series of terrorist attacks, mass casualty terrorism, and so on, suitcase nukes. Remember all of that stuff.
People would say it's like living with a target on your back.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, this is a parenthesis within a parenthesis. Isn't it astonishing? The one thing I have not heard anyone mention is that terrorism completely vanished as an election issue in the last election. Dominant throughout the 2000s, utterly invisible now. And that, I think, is a subject in itself. But the point that Mort Zuckerman made then, he said to me, very simply said, no, as long as the median age of childbearing is 31 instead of 21, young people will flock into New York. Because if you're in your 20s and you're still looking for a mate, if in your early 20s you have a mate and you begin to have a family, you go to the suburbs. But if you spend your 20s looking for a mate, nothing will drive you out of the city, because you cannot find a partner for life or fun in anywhere except in a city, he said. And so, basically he was saying that 20-somethings will put up with plague and terrorism if it means free sex. And that turned out to be an absolutely prescient idea. And we saw as the 2000s went on, what happened. It was just this huge influx of young people, for the first time in the city's history, recolonizing Brooklyn, where the flow had been for centuries that poor people raised their kids in Brooklyn, and then the ambitious kids came into Manhattan, and went just the opposite way around. We raised our kids in Manhattan, and then they flowed, and kids from all over America, and indeed from all over the world, then flowed into Brooklyn. So that the role of sexual attraction in building cities, I'm not being facetious, I think is terrifically important. That's a great point that goes on. But the other thing I wanted to say is a somewhat darker one, and it's one that worries me a great deal. I'd love to have your read on it. You mentioned good governance, right? And good governance depends, does it not, in large part on having if I can put it in old-fashioned terms, having an enlightened ruling class, having an enlightened elite. And one of the things that worries me most, and we see it in all the great institutions of New York, the Astor Library, the Morgan Library, the Frick, Metropolitan Museum, founded by merchants, Columbia, everywhere we look, we see acts of the Carnegie Mansion, where right here, we see acts of enlightened engagement in that way. And we can ask if we have a little bit of Marxism left in our consciousness, if the compensatory philanthropy is worth the previous exploitation and all of those things. Nonetheless, it goes on. But during this pandemic, exactly as you just said, we've seen this, to my mind, frightening secession of the very wealthy from the city. People fleeing the city, leaving the city dark, going off to Boccaccio country, whether it's in the Hamptons or Connecticut, wherever it would be. And here's the part that worries me, Fareed, and maybe you can assist me, is I don't see at the same time a compensatory commitment to the city. I expected within 3 weeks of the beginning of the pandemic that you would see a "We Got Your Back New York" committee composed of all of the billionaires who have spent the last 30 years, fairly or unfairly, rightly or wrongly, drawing enormous wealth out of exactly those close connections that New York offers that you described. And I assume that they would all begin to act to support the city, to support the restaurants that they love to eat in, the whole serving class who are so endangered. All of that infrastructure, I thought that would be a natural realm to support, for if nothing else, the museums that are living now on shoestrings and are endangered. Unless I missed a beat, Fareed, I didn't see that happen. I didn't see that recommitment of great wealth to a great city. And it made me worry that one of the things the pandemic was showing us was exactly that one of the stress fractures hidden within New York was exactly that economic inequality had reached a point where the upper class had effectively seceded from the rest of us.
I think it's a fascinating point, and I agree with you that I certainly don't know of any public collective commitment of the kind you're talking about. When you talk to individual institutions, you do get a sense that some of their largest patrons are stepping in. But I think that part of this may be, that we have increasingly created a kind of globalized elite who have more in common with each other and have houses in many places, and maybe have lost that deep sense of connection to a single city that they might have had in the past. Even though many of these people, of course, as you know, were arrivistes. I mean, Henry Clay Frick made his money in Pittsburgh, but then came to
shooting
New York.
strikers in Pittsburgh and then collecting art in Manhattan.
Right, exactly. I mean, Carnegie the same, Rockefeller the same. So I think that might be the change. But I would focus in, what's going to kill the city again is bad public management more than anything else, because philanthropy is great and important. And I do think there's still a lot. I mean, Barry Diller is spending hundreds of millions of dollars building an island, a cultural island off the West Side Highway, on one of those piers, and there are others. The thing I worry about is this: what has become clear is, if you look at the countries that did well in this, that did the best, which is Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong. Ironically, many of them have very large, densely packed cities with very dense public transport systems, subways, and things like that. But they had very good institutions of government. They acted early, they acted aggressively, and most importantly, they figured out a system. And the system is not so complicated, which is you test, you trace, and most importantly, you isolate the sick. So that as the vice president of Taiwan explained it to me on my show, he said, we basically did the most effective testing, tracing, and quarantining of the infected and potentially infected. Why is this important? Because by doing it, we never had to do a lockdown. He said a lockdown is a sign you failed. What we did is we took these people and we put them in a 14-day quarantine. He said overall, we did 240,000 people like that, which is 1% of Taiwan's population. And by asking these people to temporarily sacrifice their liberty for 14 days, we allowed the other 99% to flourish. And to give you a reminder of Taiwan's statistic, it's breathtaking. They have 24 million people. They have had, I believe, under 10 COVID deaths. I think the last count I saw was 7. New York, by contrast, of course, 19 million people, New York State. And the death toll is, 35,000.
Tens of thousands of people by now. That's a terrific point, and it's one you make in the book. But let's explore that a little more, because it raises the question of good governance. What do they got that we ain't got? Because we always prided ourselves on professional governance. Certainly not that long ago in the Mike Bloomberg era, that was certainly Bloomberg's self-description, and the one that I think many people, admirers or not, would ascribe to him. What have we missed? And let me ask a question on a deeper level too. What about the perpetual question, Amartya Sen's question of social capital? Is it that does Taiwan have more social capital than we do? Greater degree of social trust? It's just so much greater that it enables them to do those kinds of simple social functions. And if that's the case, what's degraded the social capital and the social trust in our city and our country?
It's a great question. I don't have a simple answer, and I want to ask you to reflect a little bit after I talk about a country you know well, which is Canada. So the thing about social trust is it clearly makes governance easier, because, very simply, the citizenry trusts the government more, it follows instructions more, it is more willing to undertake collective sacrifices. So all those things are made better. It is true, however, there is a kind of trade-off in terms of individualism and individual liberty even, and the kind of sense of rugged individualism that is at the heart of America. But I think that the problem is slightly different, at least the way I see it. To do American government right requires kind of a heroic exertion, because America is born in an anti-statist revolt. America is in its DNA anti-government. When we think of power in America, we think about dividing it, checking it, balancing it. That is an almost unique experience in the world. And so because of this legacy, it's very hard to get government to function incredibly well and efficiently. For one thing, you have it divided it's a crazy quilt patchwork of authority, center, state, locality. I mean, the truth is healthcare is actually run in 9,000 separate units, in little county hospitals and things like that. So coordinating all that requires a really active and energetic use of power. So what you need, I was talking to Sylvia Burwell, who was the HHS secretary for Obama, and she said, you've got to understand, power is divided in Washington between the three branches, among dozens of agencies, among the 50 states, among the cities and the localities. So what you need is a president who is deeply active, energetic, and has appointed people who literally spend all day corralling all these forces together and kind of forcing them to work. It can be done. I mean, Roosevelt did it, Johnson did it in his own way, Reagan did it. But what we had with Trump was somebody who really views being president as performance art. It's a reality television show. He tweets, and that is in a sense what he does as president. That's all he's doing now, for example.
But
how to make that work is hard. And so I want you to react, but I want you to talk about Canada, because it's striking to me, we don't have to go all the way to Taiwan.
No,
Canada has handled this so much better than the United States.
Well, if I may, yes, and I should explain that I am Canadian by upbringing, and Canada's my native country. My parents live on a farm outside a little tiny town called Campbellford, Ontario, whose chief civic boast is the Tim Hortons donut shop and a giant version of the Canadian toonie. That's the Canadian $2 coin. The guy who designed the toonie came from Campbellford, and that's the proudest civic boast. My kids couldn't believe it when they would go up there from New York. So one of that it's extraordinary, actually, that if you cross the border, Canada's had a very hard time with the pandemic. If you talk to Canadians, they'll see it that way. But of course, compared with us, it's been very on the whole well managed. Montreal, my hometown, has had some significant difficulties. Test and trace works in Canada. Quarantine works in Canada. I can't call him a friend, but certainly someone I admire, David Frum, like me, a Canadian expat, has written about it. I can't call him a friend just because we've never met, not because we have a feud. Has written about this, about how when he went across the border to go to his summer place in Canada from DC, they said to him, where are you going to be? You have to quarantine for 2 weeks. Who can we contact? They called him, the Canadian authorities called him regularly to make sure he was still in place. And then, of course, crossing the border in the other direction, even though there was officially from Governor Cuomo a claim of quarantine, there was no mechanism imaginable to enforce it. And here's the thing that fascinates me about that. Canada is a country with, indeed, a very high level of social capital, however you measure it. And that's tangible on the streets of Canada. The example I always love to give is that right on Bloor Street in the center of Toronto, there's an old music shop. And one of the kind of amenities of this music shop is that they keep a piano out on the street. Nice, well-tuned piano that's just there for any Torontonian to play. And people line up and they come and they play bits of music as they want to. And that thing just has been sitting there, this piano on the street, for decades, right? And I only can think, right, if you left a piano out in the street in New York, right, somebody would, in the 70s, someone would have stolen it. Now somebody would have made it into a condo, right, in that space. But that for me is a beautiful specific index of social capital, right? There's just a great deal of social trust, and everyone understands you take turns on the street piano. Canada's that kind of. But the government also works, in a kind of. There's much greater intelligence and efficiency. So, for example, the American stimulus or relief package, incredibly complicated, easy to game, became a feast for lobbyists. A lot of small businesses got nothing. The Canadian system, first of all, worked much faster, more directly. It subsidized people to stay in their jobs so that, it kind of kept everything in place. Partly a consequence of the fact that Canada, as a government and as a people, has long experience in social welfare, in the best side of social democracy. Canada had national health insurance, thanks to the great Tommy Douglas, long before almost any other country, even before Great Britain, I do believe. and
Yeah, yeah.
and has a family allowance, which everybody gets, which is universal. Even if you come from a well-off family, you get a family allowance. Obviously, it's progressive. There's progressive taxation, so it remedies that inequality. So you have a long and deeply implanted tradition which cuts across language lines and so on of the government playing a positive role in intervention. Canada, and so I think that that Canada has a model of good government in the old-fashioned sense that works that way. You know, one of the most interesting bits of research I have read, social science that I've read about the pandemic, speaks to that. And what it says is that it was done in northern Italy. Countries with a very high regions that have a very high level of measurable social capital, high levels of trust, community, non-political but interdependent agencies, had a very hard time at the beginning of the pandemic. And if you think about it, Fareed, that immediately maps onto our experience. Northern Italy was devastated by the pandemic. And it's a little puzzling because all of us who are Italophiles and love Northern Italy say the Italians have a genius for social capital. It substitutes for government, in fact, in many respects. And what they discovered is that places like Northern Italy that had a very high level of social capital got hit incredibly hard by the pandemic early on because of practices of intimacy and coexistence and so on, but then responded to the demand for social discipline far more quickly than places with low social capital. And I think you see that. I would propose that you see that in the experience of New York City. We got hit incredibly hard early on, whether it was density, whether it was bad luck, whether it was bad management, we could debate. But we got hit incredibly hard. And then the extraordinary thing was you saw New Yorkers, having experienced that, having the social discipline to wear masks and socially distance, and the numbers went down so precipitously, so dramatically. Now, obviously, they're coming back up, but even in the bad current situation, they're nowhere near as bad, it seems to me, as they are in the red states that celebrate the American tradition of individual liberty and tend to have lower social capital because they're more dispersed and alienated. So I think Canada is an example to summarize this point of exactly how social capital and a tradition of trust in government work hand in hand. But that's exactly because the government works. Government works right on people's behalf. But I wanted to ask you another question as well, Fareed, about something you said, which strikes as deep, I think, into the kind of the worldview of your book. You know, you're talking about good management. And those of us who admire, and still do admire, Barack Obama enormously, and for a lot of us who are liberals in the old-fashioned sense, right? Obama was a kind of hardly a messianic, but certainly easily
a soulmate.
Yes, a soulmate, exactly, because he saw the world in that way. And yet, I have to ask, in doing the self-inspection that liberal-minded people are compelled to do, if exactly Obama's technocratic, rational, at times detached view of the role of government didn't sow the seeds for this hideous surge of irrationalism that we are living through in some ways at its worst right now. In other words, that solving problems is not enough. Solving the rational problems that the world presents us is something that's enormously appealing to cerebral people or to analytic-minded people. But I challenge you to, if the history of the last 10 years, from everything from Brexit to the rise of Trump to Modi in India and the catastrophe of Berlusconi in Italy and over, isn't a vital reminder to us that no matter how many rational solutions we attempt, those demons of irrationality are always right around the corner and ready to defeat us if we don't have a way of placating them.
So it's funny you asked this question because I just finished reading Obama's memoirs and have written my column on it just a few hours ago. So I think that you are absolutely right, and Obama knows it. And there's this very telling passage in the book where he says, you know, I look at what I did for the economic recovery. I tried to follow the most surgical advice given, which was the fastest way to get the economy back was to inject money back through the banks rather than try to gain some kind of Old Testament vengeance from the bankers. Larry Summers, for example, suggested rather than giving the stimulus in a single lump sum, which would be very dramatic and people would feel like they've gotten a lot of money from President Obama, better to give it in a bi-weekly, their paychecks, so that they spend it, that their research showed that causes people to spend the money, which is what you're trying to do, rather than if you give them a big lump sum, they tend to save it because they think, oh, well, I've gotten $1,000, I wouldn't have. And he goes through all these rational measures. And then he says, but, I wonder if in doing that, I saved the economy and lost the country. If I had done what Roosevelt did, which is, had a much more politically minded view of it, bash the Republicans, bash the bankers, think of how Trump gave the CARES check, one single big check with his name emblazoned on. In fact, he delayed the payment of those checks by a week so that they could put his name onto it. I think there's a great deal of truth to that, but I think it's very important for us to remember what happened in the Obama years. Now I'm talking my book, which is my column, but I think the central dilemma or puzzle of the Obama administration, which he doesn't deal with a lot in his book, is that this moderate centrist Democrat who hires Larry Summers and Tim Guyton, who appoints Bob Gates, Bush's Secretary of Defense, as his Secretary of Defense, who offers Judd Gregg, a conservative New Hampshire senator, the Secretary of Commerce, who follows Mitt Romney's and the Heritage Foundation's health care plan, is very quickly pilloried as this radical socialist, the kind of obstructionism that comes to fore in the Republican Party, the kind of deep Manichaean view of Obama and the Democrats. And then, of course, the personal attacks on him as being vaguely sinister, a Manchurian candidate, which, of course, all, the apotheosis of them is that the man who wins, who becomes his successor, is a guy who starts his political career on the birtherism charge, claiming that Obama wasn't even an American. That is this leitmotif going through the Obama presidency. So I think there's something much deeper and darker going on. It's not just a reaction to a technocratic government. Look at what's going on right now. We have an attempt by the President of the United States that is being enabled by large parts of the Republican Party to overturn the results of a free and fair election. I don't think it'll succeed, but it's not for lack of trying.
It's terrifying.
Something very dark has been unleashed, and I think it's important for us to look at that clearly. There's no question to end where I began. You're right. Obama made that political mistake. He was too much of a centrist, a moderate, a technocrat, and it turned out you needed to inject more political fire. But I think there's a tsunami that took place that has to do with much deeper and darker causes.
Well, let me, if I may, in returning to the material of your book, let me press you a little bit about that. One of your chapters is called, bluntly, Inequality Will Get Worse. Inequality will get worse. Is inequality, in your mind, we've already talked about the existence of a globalized elite, which makes us sound like, populist paranoids, but nonetheless has some reality to it. Will inequality get worse? And if inequality gets worse, will that not simply drive further the tsunami of irrational nationalism that you're talking about?
So let's take a look at one example that is, as you say, my book talks about this, but my book is itself an example of it. So book sales are actually one of the industries that have benefited from COVID-19. It turns out not everyone is watching Netflix. There are few hardy souls who are reading books. Hopefully, some of them on this are watching right now. But the best estimates I can get are that in the US, Amazon was 30% of book sales in February before COVID-19 hits. It is now 65% of book sales. In other words, it has more than doubled. Now, what has it taken market share from? All the little mom and pops, all the independent bookstores. And it's probably not just true of Amazon. It's probably true of Home Depot versus the little mom and pop hardware store. Walmart is growing. So anything that is big, branded, has deep lines of credit, diverse sources of business, is able to navigate this, particularly if it has a digital presence. Think about us as workers, right? We are able to do our jobs. Most of the people probably watching are able to do their jobs. We're part of that digital elite, truth be told, right? But imagine if you work in a restaurant, a hotel, a theme park, a cruise ship,
a grocery
retail
store,
mall. Right. For you, this is the Great Depression. And so that inequality is just going to get much worse. Now, it may be temporary, but everything we know about unemployment is that, when unemployment persists longer than a few months, you have a permanent loss of wages over your life. You have a permanent loss of skills. So this is the part of my book which I got most dispirited in researching, most dispirited writing.
Most dispirited in reading it. That's why I raised it.
And it's a total tragedy that we are not providing much more quick, instant relief. I mean, the idea that we are quibbling about whether it should be 1.5 trillion or 2 trillion, just get money out to people, because a lot of people are not in our situation. They are really hurting.
What is it that what prevents that from happening? I mean, it seems there's this extraordinary resistance, and I will be blunt, on the part of Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate to do what seems like something that is in their own interest. One sometimes has the feeling that American politics have become so perverted that things that seem to be self-evidently in not just in the common interest, but in the interests of Kentucky or Indiana or Oklahoma are halted almost in a spirit of spite. We don't want to do anything that will seem to subsidize the blue states we hate.
Yeah, I mean, what you now have is a level of kind of partisanship where I talk about this in the book, right? It's become a cultural and a class divide, much more than a political divide. A political divide, in a sense, is easy. You want to spend $100 million, I want to spend zero. You split the difference. But now, because these have become identities, they relate to where you live, how you live, whether you have there was a good article in the Atlantic that said the big divide is now density and diplomas. If
Right.
you live in a densely populated area and you have a diploma, you voted for Biden. If you live in a sparsely populated area and you don't have a diploma, you voted for Trump. Well, but these things have become almost religious. And so in that circumstance, compromising, which is the normal act of politics, the foundational act, particularly of American politics, becomes a sin. And this begins with Newt Gingrich, but it has now gotten to the point where it's completely toxic. There are people talking about whether or not the Republican Senate would confirm Biden's cabinet appointments. Something that was routinely done. Right, not Supreme Court, cabinet appointments. Something has routinely been done always.
Well, what strikes me about it is exactly as you say. It's one of the great lessons of the 20th century and ongoing in the 21st century is if I may say, the anti-Marxist lesson, which is people do not, in fact, vote or pursue their interests. They vote and pursue their values, right, even when their values seem to be totally at right angles with their interests.
By the way, as do we. Most of the people on this call probably voted for Biden, and their taxes will be raised if his agenda goes through. So we shouldn't think of this as some kind of weird thing that the white working class do in Georgia.
No,
do it as well.
It's what I always say, when confronted with people who say, well, why, the only reason people in Kansas vote for Republicans when it would be in their interest as working class people to vote for Democrats is because they're misled. They're bulldozed, or they're under the illusion of Fox News or the hegemony of the capitalist media. And I always say exactly well, why do liberal Jews in New York always vote for Democrats? It's a famous thing, right? That Jews have the income of Episcopalians and they vote like Puerto Ricans, right?
That's right. That's Irving Kristol's great line.
That's Irving Kristol's great line, and it's true. And what's striking is it remains true. Yeah. It remains true despite all of the transformations. It remains true. Why is it? It's because Jews have learned, as have Indians and Muslims, that in the long run, their interests align with people who are committed to social equality, to civil liberties, and to civil rights. Even if your short-term interests align with the wealthy, your long-term interests as a community and as individuals only align with people who have a core commitment to the Bill of Rights. And I think that explains it. And we could talk about it. But the point is that our interests and our values are often in conflict,
Absolutely.
and human beings pursue their values on the whole rather than their interests. We're running short of time. I would love to have some questions. I'm not sure if we can get them. I'm not seeing them on the chat line. But let me ask you, because it's I don't want to, though I want to focus obviously on New York. I would love you to talk a little bit about one of the other chapters that I learned an enormous amount from, and that is the one on globalization. You make the case that globalization is not dead, despite tariffs and despite Brexit and despite all of the reactions against it, that you see globalization as an inexorable and unstoppable tide. And that also leads you to talk about China and American China, Sino-American relations, we used to call them. I wonder if you'd say a few things about both those things.
So if you look, this is a good week to talk about it, Adam, because this week the East Asians signed something called the RCEP, RCEP, which is one of the largest trade agreements in the world. It's a huge expansion of trade, lowering of barriers, mostly helps developing countries that trade with China. The one that happened before it, just a few months before the pandemic hit, was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which you will recall hearing a lot about, and people thought that it went away. No. The United States didn't sign it. Every other country, the other 11 countries, all signed on to it. The other big news this year was that African nations came together and did a free trade agreement. So I think that we here have a kind of distorted prism from two things. One, the rhetoric after the pandemic was everybody was, oh, we're too dependent on foreign trade. We have all these crazy people coming in from all over the world. We're going to clamp down on that. The reality is actually that everybody wants growth. Everybody is searching for new markets, new investments. And that search has accelerated over the last 30 or 40 years. We're in a modest deceleration right now. There's no question. After 7 decades of essentially continuous expansion, globalization has taken a pause. I have a graph in the book that demonstrates this very, very clearly. But the second piece is it's Donald Trump and Trump's America and Trump's America First policies. The United States has imposed in the last 4 years the highest levels of tariff that it has had since Smoot-Hawley in the 1930s. Trump has put on more tariffs than anybody else. As a result of it, we have paid more subsidies to farmers, for example, I think $60 billion and counting, to compensate them for their loss of business, the retaliatory tariffs that the Chinese put on. So we are living in a little protectionist cocoon right now, a kind of protectionist experiment that Donald Trump has raised, by the way, which has failed miserably. The American trade deficit, which is the mark of it, which was he used to brandish and say, look at this huge trade deficit. The American trade deficit has gone up every quarter that Donald Trump has been in office and is currently at a record high. So we are living in a somewhat America First cocoon. The rest of the world is moving on. And this is maybe a kind of a metaphor where we need to understand if we don't get our act together, the others are. And they're busily trading with one another. They're expanding trade. There will be some, I would describe them as largely cosmetic changes, where there will be some supplies that are redirected so that you can say you're manufacturing face masks at home, even though the next crisis will probably not require face masks. But the larger issue, which I'll just hint at here, is there is a de-Sinification of the world economy taking place. A lot of countries are feeling they are too dependent on China. They're too dependent on China for certain raw materials or finished products or whatever it is. That's totally legitimate. By the way, some of those dependencies were in the 98, 99% range. It makes sense to diversify. The US is doing it, but you know where they're diversifying to? India, Vietnam, Mexico, Bangladesh. So that's not deglobalization, that's reglobalization. The whole China piece is obviously a much larger issue and involves geoeconomics and geopolitics. And we'll probably have to leave it for another day because I notice we're running out of time.
We have a couple of, I would love to go on with you. And I would also, I have a question of my own to raise, but let me share a couple of questions from our listeners. One question we have is, what do you think of the Green Energy Plan, which is not the Green New Deal, but Biden's Green Energy Plan? assuming that Biden will be inaugurated, as he has won the presidency. Will that help create jobs that are needed in rural America and help ease, therefore, the crucial divide, the density and diploma divide that you were talking about before, that's been so toxic for America?
It's a great plan. It has elements that are absolutely superb. I am a little bit less hardline than he is on natural gas, because I think you need natural gas both as a jobs program, but also as a bridge to cleaner technologies. Remember, natural gas has lower emissions than coal. It has some problems with methane that can be fixed. But at this point, we want to use everything that lowers emissions. And by and large, what the Green Energy Plan is a massive investment in new technologies. I think it would be terrific. Will it bridge the divide? Here's the problem. All growth in jobs these days tends to come in skilled jobs. Remember what I was saying about density and diplomas? It turns out the diplomas part is very important. So once people have diplomas, as they're even within these states, they tend to move to Atlanta or Houston or Dallas, which are essentially blue cities within red states. So I don't know that it changes the political divide, but it's terrific economics.
And which in turn then bluify those states, as we saw in Georgia
exactly.
just 2 weeks ago. And finally, one question here, which speaks to an image in your book that comes from Lawrence of Arabia. Fareed, is it written or is nothing written?
So I will quickly tell the story. So this is a scene in Lawrence of Arabia that I love, where Lawrence is
written by Robert Bolt, if you'll allow me to add an authorial point. A David Lean movie, but a Robert Bolt script.
Exactly, one of the great screenwriters who also wrote Man for All Seasons. Lawrence is taking these Arabs across the desert to attack the Ottoman Empire. One of them gets left behind in a sandstorm. They realize it, and Lawrence wants to go back, and the Arabs say to him, "No, his time has come. He's meant to die. It is written." And Lawrence looks at them and says, "Nothing is written." And he goes back and rescues him and comes back to the camp, a hero's welcome. And I use it just as a metaphor to say, when times of great change, the mistake is to assume that because there are all these trends afoot, something is inevitable, something is inexorable. And it's not. If you look at the 1920s and how they could have gone, if the United States had stayed in the League of Nations, it had stayed in Europe, if the Brits and the French had not put such harsh, punitive terms on Germany, you can imagine the late 1940s going very differently if somebody other than Stalin was running the Soviet Union. You can imagine so many moments that could have gone differently. Imagine if in 2000, Al Gore had won and George Bush had not. Imagine what the reaction to 9/11 would have been. Imagine, we know that Gore was a deep critic of the Iraq War. So I want us to remember that when we look at these trends and say, we get to write our own future.
Fareed, that's a beautiful point to end us on. And I have so many more things I'd love to talk about with you, about our response to the pandemic in India and so on, but we'll have to save it for another night. 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World is the book. And Fareed, thank you for your company tonight. And Dan, can I turn it back to you?
You sure can. And thank you so much, Adam and Fareed, for this incredible conversation. We are very grateful for your insights. And, on the subject of good public management to get us out of this mess, I just thought that it might make sense to make a quick public service announcement, which is that there's been so much time and energy spent on the presidential election that I think many New Yorkers are just beginning to realize that in a number of months, only a number of months, there will be an election for city leadership in New York, and not just for mayor. That, of course, would be big enough. But because of the way our system works, we have most office holders at all levels in New York City term limited. And you're going to have a new mayor, a new controller, a new borough president in most boroughs, and 2/3 of the city council. They're term limited and will be gone. And so there is going to be a fresh leadership in New York City at all levels. And the primaries are in June, not September. And we're going to be employing ranked choice voting for the first time in New York City So there's a lot of things that people should be thinking about when they're considering good public management right here in New York City. But I will just say we are so lucky to have you both here tonight. Fareed, congratulations on the book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. It is a compelling read. We thank you both for doing this event tonight in partnership with Riverside Park Conservancy. We are determined to make this particular slice of New York City healthy, safe, and in top condition for the many New Yorkers who count on it. For those of you who have been tuning in, we thank you for your support. If you haven't done it already, please text CITIES to 91999 with your gift, $50 or more. We are going to send you this great book, and let us all hope that we get to that post-pandemic world sooner rather than later. Fareed, thank you. Adam, thank you. And to everyone watching at home, thank you again, and good night.
Good night.